Welcome to the Door Roller Money Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Berger. Today in episode 307, we're going to talk about a concept known as mental models. And this episode, unlike most of the, previous 306 episodes of this podcast, it's not going to be directly related to personal finance and investing. Frankly, it's going to have a much broader application to our lives. And I plan several podcasts like this over the next couple of months. It certainly has applications to personal finance and investing, as you'll see. And kind of what motivated this was a realization that, when you want to get better at something, whether it's managing your money or something at your job or a sport, whatever it might be, while you certainly need to work, directly on the skill you're trying to improve, you can often see improvement when you kind of work on ancillary things as well. And I'll give you maybe not a perfect example, but it's one that comes to mind. I train 5 days a week at a gym, and one of the things that I struggle with is mobility. My shoulders, I don't have great mobility through my shoulders, through my hips, and it affects a lot of different things I try to do, like a back squat or a front squat. When I used to throw my back out, it was doing a deadlift. And if I try to do anything over my head, some sort of pressing motion over my head, the lack of mobility in my shoulders is a real problem. And the other day I was talking to one of the trainers, and he suggested some breathing exercises. And I thought, well, that seems kind of strange. I mean, I would expect, a trainer to suggest that I do some stretching or things like that, but breathing exercises, how's that going to help me? And it turns out he was right. There are certain breathing exercises you can do, particularly through your shoulders, believe it or not, that really help your mobility. It doesn't solve the problem. I mean, that takes some time, I've learned. It's one of those, 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing, particularly as you get older. But I thought it's interesting that a breathing exercise, I just wouldn't have, correlated this idea of a breathing exercise on the one hand with mobility on the other. And I think that's true in a lot of different, probably in just about every field. Where, another example, by the way, if you've read the book, The Power of Habit, a great book to read, but in that book, Charles Duhigg compares the habit of exercise with how you handle your money. And while it's not fully understood, what they found is developing the habit of regular exercise actually can help you better manage your finances. And so it's interesting to see these, non-obvious relationships. In the case of mental models, I think the relationship between mental models and our money will be far more obvious. But still, I plan a number of different podcasts covering things like how to develop good habits, how to be more productive, how to learn. I mean, that's certainly part of finances and investing. And learning itself is a skill. So we're going to talk about a number of these different things. Today, we're going to start with mental models. And to introduce mental models, I want to talk a moment about chess. As you know, I'm trying to become a chess grandmaster, which is kind of like saying I'm trying to, get good enough at basketball to join the NBA. A pretty silly goal, really, but why not aim for the stars? So, one of the things I bought years ago was a book written by Laszlo Polgar, and apologies if I've completely obliterated his first name. But many of you, maybe some of you have heard of the Polgar sisters. They were 3 sisters, and they were all excellent chess players. One of them, Judith, was a top 10 super grandmaster, actually played for the world championship at one point. All phenomenal at chess. It's an interesting story. Before their father and mother were married, the father kind of planned that they would teach their children to become phenomenal chess players. Right from the very beginning, that would be their plan. And he proposed that to her before they even got engaged. So this was sort of a long-term plan. They're from Hungary. They ended up having 3 daughters. They homeschooled them, and they trained them in chess from a very, very early age. And they all became phenomenal chess players. Judith, perhaps the best of the 3, but all phenomenal chess players. And it was kind of almost like a science experiment. I don't know if it's fair to describe it as a science experiment on your 3 daughters, but maybe it was. But it was the idea of, is it talent? Is it natural born talent that can produce a grandmaster, or is it training? I guess in this case, maybe it shows it's training. I don't know. But that was the idea. And the father wrote a book. And I'm holding it up for you guys watching this on YouTube. As you can see, It's a rather thick book. It's over 1,000 pages. And it's nothing but one chess puzzle after another. There's 5,334 chess puzzles. And I bought this book years ago and was immediately disappointed with it. And the reason I was disappointed is that the problems are too easy. It sounds like a good problem to have, right? The first 300 or so are just one-move checkmates. So just white to move, one move, and white checkmates black. And not only that, but most of the puzzles only have a few pieces. It's not like there's a ton of pieces on the board and you got to figure out what's important and what's not important. A lot of them, it's just each side has a king, of course, and then white has a queen, or white has a queen and a pawn, or maybe black has a pawn. And it gets a little more complicated than that. But you get the idea. It does move on to two-move checkmates and even three-move checkmates, which certainly are more complicated. But I found that, given enough time, I could solve these. I was expecting a more difficult book. So I was disappointed, and I put it aside for years. And I've more recently started to work through it. I'm actually working through all 5,000 puzzles. And I've concluded that actually it's a brilliant chess book. And the reason was something I just didn't appreciate when I first bought it, and it's really apropos to the idea of mental models. So bear with me. If you can imagine trying to solve a one-move checkmate puzzle in chess, if you, to the extent you play chess, you'd say that's got to be pretty easy. But even if you don't, it's just one move. How hard can it be? And indeed, the puzzles aren't that hard. But how would you solve that puzzle? As long as you knew how the pieces moved, you knew the rules of the game, how would you go about solving it? And I think for most chess players, and if you're thinking through it as a non-chess player, you'd say, well, I'd look to see what moves I had as white that could put black in check. And then I'd kind of go through a checklist of black's options. Well, can black move his king here? No, he'd still be in check. Can he move it over here? No, that doesn't work. He'd still be in check. Can he capture, say, the queen that's put black in check? No, he can't capture the queen. You'd sort of go through this checklist of options for black. And if everything worked out and black didn't have any other options, you'd say, okay, I've solved the puzzle. Checkmate, right? And you might do that very quickly, right? It just mental checklist might take you 10 seconds, 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds. It might not take long at all. And you kind of see why I was a little disappointed with the book at first. But then I realized that a super grandmaster, or for that matter, a grandmaster, or even just a very good chess player, actually wouldn't solve that puzzle that way at all. They wouldn't go through that mental checklist. They wouldn't have to. Why? They'd recognize the pattern. They will have seen the pattern that results in checkmate over and over and over and over again. They'll have a mental model. You see where I'm going here? They could look at that position and immediately know the move. Now, in a game, they might run through the checklist just to be sure, but they wouldn't have to, to know the move. They could look at the pattern and recognize it. And what I found is that for grandmasters, of course, they have far more patterns etched in their memory than, say, I do. And so they can recognize patterns much faster in much more complicated positions, and they have more patterns memorized. And if you think about trying to beat a grandmaster in chess, you're immediately at a disadvantage, right? Because where they can immediately see patterns that you can't see, that might help them not only find the best move, it may also help them eliminate suboptimal moves that I might have to spend a lot of time evaluating. Because I don't have the patterns memorized that, say, a grandmaster does. Well, I think that's a good way to think about mental models. That's what they do, good ones. They help us make better decisions. They help us understand the world in a better way. They help us understand human behavior. And there are what I'll call sort of generic or general mental models that sort of apply to life generally. But then there are mental models that are specific. Engineers are going to have certain mental models that non-engineers are not going to understand. As a lawyer, there were certainly mental models that lawyers develop that if you don't practice law, you're not going to develop. You're not going to have a need to develop them. So the point is there are mental models that are specific to individual fields. So what I want to do today is talk a bit about mental models. I'm going to kind of describe what I think makes for a good mental model. And I'm going to give you a list of, let's see here, I've written down 11. There are, really the number of mental models is only limited by our imagination. But I want to cover 11 of them today. And as I said, some will, I think, directly relate to personal finance and investing, but I think all of them can, help us make better decisions in life, and that can help us in all areas, not just our finances. I'll start by saying that a lot of people cite Charlie Munger. Now, he's the business partner of Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway. He gave a speech to the graduating class. I think it was Stanford Business School, I believe, in 1994, where he talked about mental models. He called it a lattice work. The idea was, look, you're going to have all kinds of bits of information bombarding you throughout your life, and you have to have some kind of framework in which to understand this information, put it in its right place, and then decide if it's useful to you, and if it is, how. And it's actually a speech. It's a fairly long speech, and I read it just the other day. It's worth reading. So if you Google Charlie Munger's speech to Stanford 1994, you'll find it. It's worth reading. But that's sort of, you'll see if you research mental models, you'll see a lot of folks that write about them. Shane Parrish is one at Farnham Street Blog, named after the street where Berkshire Hathaway has its headquarters. James Clear writes a lot about them. You'll see them regularly cite Charlie Munger's speech to the Stanford graduating class in 1994, and it's definitely a speech I think worth reading. So again, at a high level, a mental model is nothing more than a heuristic, a rule of thumb, a pattern, a framework to better understand the world, to better understand people. And the best mental models, I think, have certain characteristics. The first one is they help us make decisions better, right? If they don't help us do something, they might be interesting, but just academically so, perhaps. I think the best mental models are ones that actually help us in life, right? And one way is to help us make better decisions. And that can come in different forms. One of them is to make better decisions faster, right? I mean, that's to go back to the Grand Master. I might, if I'm lucky enough, come up with the right move, the same move a Grand Master would, but speed matters. He or she might be able to find the move instantly or very quickly because they have a pattern that they've recognized, that they've seen before, whereas I have to struggle through and rule out other options to come to the right decision through lots and lots of calculations. So mental models that can help us make decisions faster are very valuable. If they can help us make decisions with more confidence, that's particularly true in investing. I think confidence, not misplaced confidence, but confidence in what we're doing is incredibly valuable when it comes to investing, particularly when, like now, markets aren't doing so well. The other thing a good mental model can do in terms of decision making is help us filter out the noise, right? Again, not to overdo a chess analogy, but oftentimes finding the right move on a chessboard is a matter of figuring out what's important and what's not important. There's a lot of, there might be a lot of pieces on the board, but at the end of the day, there's just one square that really matters in that position, and that's you need to know that. And once you know that, you can focus on finding the right move. Certainly, the same thing is true with investing. If you invest in individual stocks, for example, and you read a Form 10-K annual report filed by a company with the SEC, what you'll find is a wealth of information, most of which is by and large irrelevant to the question of whether it's a good investment or not. And part of the challenge of sound investing is understanding what's important and what's not important, right? The other thing a good mental model can do is help us eliminate bad decisions. I don't know if you recall, for those of you that have taken standardized tests before, SATs, ACTs, I took the LSAT. One of the strategies is to eliminate clearly wrong choices. So your goal, right, is to get the right answer. But one of the strategies to narrow it down is to eliminate the obviously bad answers. And my experience was if you had 4 multiple choice, that eliminated 2 of them, and then I had no idea which of the remaining 2 were correct. But the idea, again, is eliminate the bad choices. And mental models can help us do that. And eliminating the clearly suboptimal choices can go a long way in helping us make the right choice. And then the third thing, I think good mental models, as I've alluded to, can help us see non-obvious connections between things. One example, and that we're going to come to in one of the 11 mental models, is the Latte Factor. I think one of the great things that concept does is connect the seemingly small everyday decisions we make with our money to long-term wealth. A connection that's, to me, I mean, it's hopefully obvious to long-term listeners of this podcast, but I don't think it's obvious at first blush. If you've not spent a lot of time thinking about money, thinking about your finances, we just don't equate, our small daily purchases with having enough money to retire on or achieving financial freedom at a younger age. And I think the mental model, which is really what the Latte Factor is, helps us see that connection. So mental models that help us make non-obvious connections, I think, are particularly valuable. And then the final thing I'll say before we get to specific mental models is mental models can be very personal to you, right? I have mental models that I use that are specific to my own personality. As an example, I've learned, sometimes the hard way, that I tend to get excited about a new project and immediately sort of just dive into the deep end with a new project. And then a couple of days later, I'm like, yeah, this is not what I want to do. And having experienced that enough, one of the sort of mental models I have when I get excited about a new project is to just, okay, let's stop. We're going to take a breath and we're going to just put it on the shelf for a couple of days. And if I'm still excited about it, a couple of days from now, a week from now, all right, we'll take it off the shelf. We'll re-examine it. We'll decide if that's what I'm going to do. But I need those couple of days to sort of just take a break before committing to something big. And that wasn't obvious to me at first. It took some life experience to figure that out. But that's very personal to me. You may not have that same issue. You may have other issues, right? And so, when you think about mental models, and part of the goal of this podcast actually is for you to think in terms of mental models, not just the 11 we're going to cover, but ways to think of decision-making and frameworks to understand the world that are specific to you, that can help you either make a good decision or, as we said, avoid making a bad decision, right? And one last thing, real quick, before we get to the 11, is this. While you might not be familiar with the term mental model, or you don't go around using it a lot if you are familiar with it, the reality is we all use mental models, whether we realize it or not, in making decisions, in allowing information into our lives or rejecting it, right? An example, I never thought about this as a mental model, but it's exactly what it is. I am very adverse to people trying to predict the stock market. And if you listen to finance news, you're bombarded with it. It's just, we just can't help ourselves. It's just like, and you notice when they bring someone on, let's say CNBC or wherever, and they're going to interview them about where they think the stock market's going. How do they introduce them? It's the same way every time. This person correctly predicted the tech bubble crash in 2000, early 2000s, or they correctly predicted the housing crash, so in other words, we're trying to build up their credentials. This person's a really good predictor of the future. And the reality is people are predicting the future all the time and in vastly different ways. And someone's going to be right because, if you throw 1 million darts at the dartboard, some of them are going to hit the bullseye. And but my mental model tells me we're not good at predicting the future when it comes to interest rates or the stock market. And we ought not be making investment decisions based on the prediction of future markets, at least in the short term. And so that's a mental model I use to basically filter out the noise, because that's exactly what it is to me. And so, again, we use mental models in our lives, whether we realize it or not. And actually, one of the things I think is a really good exercise is to think about the frameworks, the patterns, the beliefs that you have that you use to filter information and make decisions that you may not even have realized or really thought through and articulated. And I think just the process of understanding what frameworks we use to make decisions in and of itself can be very enlightening and helpful. Okay, so 11 mental models. Number one, and by the way, the names that I've given these some of them are specific to just names I've come up with to describe them. Most of them actually are that, I would say. And so anyway, number one, second order thinking. And this really comes from chess. I see a great move on the chessboard. I want to move my queen over here. If I just stop there, I'm often going to make a really bad decision, right? I need to say, okay, but wait a minute. If I move the queen there, now what happens? What's the effect of that? And, the what if question. I talk about what if a lot when it comes to financial decisions, right? If you want to make a big change, but you immediately reject it. I can't, I'd like to get rid of my car. Who wants a car payment? And you stop your analysis there. I can't get rid of my car. I've got to get to work. I've got to get to the grocery store. Well, that may be right. Just like my queen move might be the right move, but we need to have some second order thinking and say, okay, well, wait a minute. Well, what if I got rid of my car? What would I do? How would I survive? Well, I might move closer to work. I might take public transportation. The list could go on, and at the end of that, you still might decide, yeah, I'm not going to sell my car. But I think this sort of second order thinking model can be very, very useful in all areas of our life, particularly if we're about to make a decision out of emotion. You're fed up with your boss. You're just going to go in there and let him or her have it. It's like, yeah, let's okay. If I do that, I'll feel really good right now. But what are the effects of that? Maybe I'm out of job. Maybe I've spent 4 years here and now I don't even have a recommendation that they're going to give me for my next job. What's the effect of this decision I'm about to make? I see this a lot in politics where politicians will propose legislation, and I think, there's some positives of what they're proposing, but there's a lot of negatives. Are they even considering the consequences of what will happen if we do whatever? Second order thinking, I think it can help us see the ramifications of our decisions. And again, we may stick with the decision we were going to make, the move we were going to make. We may not. But I think taking some time to sort of ask the what if question. Okay, what if I do that? Then what happens? It can help us make better decisions. So that's the first one. So I call it second order thinking. Randomness. That is another mental model. And what's challenging about it is a lot of things that are random don't appear random. You ever notice when the stock market's up or down and you looking at a financial site, they always tell you why. They always know why. It's down because of a trade dispute between China and the U.S. It's down because the Fed chairman made a comment about raising rates, or it's up because of an earnings release from a company. Well, they may be right. That may be why it's up or down. Then again, they could be completely wrong. How do they know? I mean, it may be true that the Fed chair made a comment about interest rates. And it may even be true that following that comment, the market went down. And you say, well, that's why it went down. But the reality is a lot of things affect the market. And while this sort of commentary might be right sometimes, it may also be wrong. And I think we can get into trouble when we're too quick to assign cause and effect to something. I mean, sometimes, yes, cause A creates effect B, but that's not always the case. And I think far more in the world is either random or its true cause and effect is not really known. And if we're too quick to associate cause and effect, it can result in decisions down the road that aren't the best. All right, the third one I alluded to is compound interest. I again kind of lumped the Latte Factor into this. We've discussed this many times on the show, but the compound interest is a beautiful thing. And in my writing, including some stuff that'll be coming out in a couple of months, I do a lot of calculations. And I have to be honest with you, I'll get out the Excel spreadsheet, I'll do the calculation, and I'm stunned at the result. I have to go back and double check. Oh no, there's no way you have that much money. I'll give you a specific example. This is in something that I'm working on that I'll talk more about hopefully in January. I was trying to figure out, how someone could become a millionaire off of a relatively small salary. So I thought, well, let's assume a college grad is making $50,000 a year. They're right out of college, and I thought, well, let's make it harder on them. Let's assume they're never going to get a raise. $50,000 out of college is good, but if you never got a raise, that'd probably be a little disappointing. We're going to assume you work from 22 until 67, which is full retirement age, at least for me. That's 45 years. And you never get a raise. Reasonably speaking, realistically, could you become a millionaire? And I thought, well, let's make it even harder. Let's assume you can only save 5% of your salary. That's what, $2,500 a year. So you never get a raise. You can only save 5%. And I assumed a 9.3% return, which is the return rate over the last 100 years for a portfolio of 70% stocks, 30% bonds. You come up with about 1.7 million. That's the result. Now, I understand inflation, but of course, I'm not giving anyone a raise here, right? So I'm at least taking the inflation. I'm not taking it out of the return number, I guess. I am taking it out of the salary. And when I saw that number, I thought, well, that can't be right? I mean, this is wrong. So I double and triple checked it. I mean, compound interest, I work with these calculations regularly, and they still surprise me. So there you go. Compound interest, or I call it, the Latte Factor is really a related but different mental model. I group them together. And it could, because, we're so easy to dismiss the money we spend, the small amounts of money we spend day in and day out. And the Latte Factor, combined with compound interest, reminds us that saving even relatively small amounts of money over time generates, a pile of cash. All right, number 4. Number 4 is, I call it business cycles. And I've used this to invest and I think do fairly well. And the model is simply this. You have a well-run company with a good brand, management that's doing smart things with the money, which to me means you're not making stupid acquisitions. You're not overpaying your executives. You're not giving away stock like candy at Christmas. You're maybe paying a reasonable dividend. You're buying back stock when it makes sense. You're investing in your company when it makes sense. It's a well-run company. But because of different business cycles, there are times when your company doesn't do well, at least relative to the good years. And one example of this, in my opinion, is Deere, right? John Deere, nothing runs like a deer. They had a couple years where their stock was just crushed because commodity prices were down, right? Corn and wheat. I mean, the prices for farming, for these commodities were down. So farmers weren't buying equipment. They didn't have the money. And I think it was a pretty good buy. And in fact, since then, it's come back up. I don't currently have a position in it. We gave what we had to charity, I think. This was a couple of years ago. But that is an example of business cycles. There are ups and downs in businesses depending on what industry they're in. And if you realize that and you study it, I think you can make some pretty smart investing decisions. But you have to, keep an eye on it and you have to study it. And that's just one example. Another example that I'll give you that's a little different, it's happening right now, is Apple. Now, I do own Apple. And what I've noticed there is not so much a business cycle necessarily, but what I've noticed is that Apple will say something that spooks the market. The recent example is they said, I think the guidance for the next quarter wasn't what the experts thought it should be. So the stock has really come down. I don't know what it's trading at today. I think it's in the 160s maybe, but it was 220, 230. It had a market value over $1 trillion. I think it's under 800 billion now. So it's really come down. And I view that as a buying opportunity. Now, I'm not recommending that to you. You make your own decisions on that. But I bought more Apple stock. And by the way, has nothing to do with what I think the stock will do in the short term. I have no idea how it's, what 2019 will look like for Apple in terms of the stock price, or 2020. But I do believe it's a well-run company with an excellent brand, an excellent balance sheet, doing smart things with its money. The other thing, by the way, that people freaked out on was that they were no longer going to disclose unit sales on iPhones. And I kind of get the market's reaction, although when you look at it a little more closely, one, you find out that other cell phone makers don't disclose unit volume. And given the way Apple makes money, it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't disclose unit volume. That's a whole other topic. But in any event, I've noticed these cycles that happen with companies, including Apple, and I use that as an opportunity to buy some more. And so that's the fourth model. Again, I call it business cycles. That's probably more applicable to my Deere example than the Apple example, but hopefully you get the idea. All right, number 5. This is a big one. I call it the myth of sacrifice. And I've given this example before, but it's the mocha example, where for years I had a mocha almost every day, mocha latte at Starbucks or a coffee shop here. I'd go there, I'd work a little bit, and I just couldn't imagine not having my mocha. I mean, the thought of not having a mocha was a huge sacrifice. And then one day I decided to go cold turkey, and the reason wasn't for money, it was for health. They're not exactly good for you. And it was painful. I mean, for a good couple of weeks, I missed the mocha. It's like all I could think about. Stupid mocha latte. And then after about, I don't know, 2 weeks or so, didn't miss it. And it taught me that there are, basically, it's almost like an addiction. I mean, we think it's going to be painful to do without something. And maybe it is for a short period of time. But what I've learned over time, it goes away. I learned this really as a kid when our TV went out. We had no money, couldn't get it fixed, couldn't get a new TV. This was back in the day when families only had one TV, not like 13. You didn't have iPads, you didn't have laptops. I mean, that the TV in the family room was like, that was your entertainment. I mean, there it was. And ours broke. We couldn't get it fixed. And I mean, I went through withdrawal symptoms, I think. It's like they had to put me on a 24-hour watch. And like 2-3 weeks later, it's like I didn't even think about it. The myth of sacrifice. I think it's a very good mental model. By the way, it doesn't mean you should give up TV. And I'm not telling you to give up your mocha latte if that's your thing. But I am saying you shouldn't convince yourself that you got to have this or life as you know it's just not going to be worth living. That's probably not true. The sixth model is kind of the opposite of the myth of sacrifice, and I call it the myth of happiness. We think certain things are going to make us happy. If I can just get that kitchen remodel, and because I've got the perfect stainless steel refrigerator, one of those built-in models, it'll be perfect. It'll be a gorgeous kitchen. Or if I can just get the bathroom remodeled, if I can just get that car, whatever that is for you. And the list could go on and on. Maybe your ideas are a little smaller, less expensive than that. It's not that you shouldn't get these things. We've remodeled our kitchen in the past, so it's not that these things are bad or that you shouldn't do them, whatever they might be. But I think we can sometimes build them up in our minds as more important and contributing more to our happiness than they really will. Because, when you get that new car, it's new, and you get new car smell, and you got all the gadgetry you're playing with in the dashboard, the screens, whatever. And then 6 months later, it's a car that gets you to work. That's what it is. Doesn't mean it was a bad purchase. Doesn't mean you should go out and sell it. But I think when we see ourselves getting too excited about a purchase, maybe we should think about this mental model and at least take a breath and think about it. Again, doesn't mean we shouldn't buy it, whatever that might be. But by the way, at first, this kind of depressed me. I was like, well, then what's going to make me happy? And I know you're thinking, Rob, you need to stop your whining. Yeah, that's kind of what I said to myself too. Maybe my health and my family might actually be a bigger driver of happiness than a Series 4 Apple Watch. Not that that's not a pretty impressive gadget. All right, the myth of happiness. You get the idea. Inversion is the seventh one. Charlie Munger talks a lot about this. The best example I can give is to go back to the SAT example. The goal of each question is to get the right answer. But sometimes inverting it can help us. So rather than looking for the right answer, let's eliminate the wrong answers, right? Kind of think of it as sort of looking at a problem in reverse, right? It can help us solve complicated problems. Kind of a related concept from the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Covey is to begin with the end in mind. Start with the end, right? What's our goal? And then kind of work backwards, right? And I think this inversion can help us a lot. I kind of use it in our home, in my office. I think there are times when I get into this mode of, well, I want to really make this room nice. What can I do to it? What can I add to it? Maybe I get some artwork or whatever. And then I think, actually, maybe I should invert that. What can I do to make this room, not as bad as it is? What can I take out of the room, maybe, that could improve the flow or whatever? I'm looking around my shop as I say that, and I'm thinking there's a ton of crap I could take out of here. But in any event, inversion can be a very powerful tool. And it's worth thinking about, particularly when you encounter thorny, complex problems. All right, number 8 is the mental model of small gains, small wins. And I was actually writing about this today. There's a principle related called the progress principle. If you think about small gains, small wins, it's kind of Dave Ramsey's justification for the debt snowball, right? We all know that the debt avalanche, which is where you order your debts based on the interest rate from highest to lowest and pay the debt with the highest interest rate first, mathematically is both the fastest way to get out of debt and the cheapest. But the debt snowball, where you order your debts from the smallest balance to the largest and tackle the smallest balance first, while it may take you, depending on your interest rates, may take you longer to get out of debt, may cost you more, studies have shown that those small wins, because you're going to pay off a debt faster, and that feels good, it's encouraging, you feel and see the progress. By the way, you're making progress either way, but because you pay off a debt completely, it just feels like more progress, right? You get that credit card paid off, it just feels good. Studies have shown that it encourages people, motivates folks to stay the course and to continue working on their debt. So it's when you're confronted with a big goal, think of ways you can break that goal up into small pieces. Whether it's it could be losing weight, obviously your finances, or maybe you have a huge project at work. Break it up into small gains. The key is to be consistently making measurable, well-defined progress. If you can do that, studies show that it will encourage you to keep going and to keep moving closer to your bigger goals. So, mental models, small gains or small wins, are the progress principle is another way. In fact, there's a book on it called The Progress Principle, which you could check out if you want to read more about that. Number 9, I won't spend any time on because I've already mentioned it, and that's stock market predictions. That's remember, a mental model can help you filter out the noise, right? The signal to noise ratio you'll hear people talk about. I want the information that's important and useful to me, and I don't want it clouded with useless information. So when I hear people start to predict the stock market, if I listen at all, it's for entertainment value. It's not because I'm taking notes because I need to make a decision on my investment, my portfolio. But that is a mental model that I have to help me understand not only information that's coming in from pundits about where they think the stock market's going to go, but also it helps me understand the movements of the market, which is to say I don't understand them completely, and that's okay. But that's the mental model that I have. And it turns out that the way I invest, I don't need to know what they're going to be in the short term. Number 10, though, is kind of, you may find this one a little contrary to number 9 on stock market predictions. Number 10 is, I call it the 10-year prediction. When I want to understand a company like Apple, I don't know where it's going to be in 6 months. I certainly don't know where the stock price is going to be in 6 months. But I think a better question is, where will the company be in 10 years? And at first, you might say that, Rob, that you're telling me you can't predict 6 months from now, but you're going to predict 10 years? That doesn't make any sense. Well, I'm predicting something, though, that's a little different. I'm not predicting the stock market price of an index, or in this case, an individual company like Apple, 10 years from now. What I'm trying to predict is where I think the company will be 10 years from now. And I first saw this with Warren Buffett when he was talking about his investment in Coca-Cola, which I think that initial investment was in the 1980s, I believe. But in any event, of course, he rattles through numbers incredibly fast. It's unbelievable, the math this guy can do in his head. But he went through how he looked at it for almost a global level. This was the penetration Coca-Cola has in the world. And here's the population growth that we can expect in the world over the next X number of years. And given that, and assuming they have the same penetration, here's the number of bottles of Coke they'll be selling. And if they can enter these markets, which they don't have very well yet, it can be to this. And so he was looking at sort of the long-term path of Coca-Cola. Now, none of this is, of course, guaranteed. A lot of different things can happen. But what I find is that when you're looking at investments, it's much better to think, where will this index be in 10 years? Where will this company be in 10 years? When I look at Apple, I feel very confident about its 10-year, where it will be in 10 years. And I'm actually working through some math, trying to take some guesstimates on where I think sales will be for Apple 10 years from now, which is in a way a crazy prediction. But the beautiful thing is I can be wrong in the particulars as long as I'm right in the general direction, right? But that's the challenge of individual stocks. I think most of you probably don't invest in individual stocks. And so the better question is, well, where do you think the markets will be in 10 years or 20 years? If we're focused on that, the fact that we've had a couple of days where the market's lost 3% really isn't that significant. It may not be fun to live through, but when you think of them in 10-year chunks and 20-year chunks, what the markets do in December of 2018 just doesn't matter that much. And so I kind of try to take a 10-year view with my investing. All right, the 11th and final mental model for today is, I name it, I call it after Ryan Holiday's book, The Obstacle is the Way. And the idea behind this is that sometimes the best course we can take is the hardest, right? We like easy things. Who wants obstacles? Who wants challenges in the way? But the reality is, it's when we work through the obstacles and the challenges that we get the most growth. In some areas, it's kind of obvious. Weightlifting is one example. You got to challenge yourself, and you got to lift the weights that are uncomfortable. You don't want to hurt yourself, but I mean, within reason, you've got to lift the weights that are hard to lift. Otherwise, you don't get stronger. In that context, it's sort of obvious. But in life and investing in business and relationships, I mean, some of the best progress I've made in relationships is when you have a difficult conversation that no one really wants to have, but you really need to have it. And if you do, and you have it in the right way, as hard as it might be, the relationship will get stronger, right? The list could go on and on and on. I mean, some of the best progress I had in my business was when I was faced, not by choice, but when I was faced with challenges and obstacles. And I could have, just sort of given up. But what I found is working through them actually resulted in the best and most growth in the company. So you could give example after example. Now, it doesn't mean, and we can say about all of these models, it doesn't mean we blindly follow them, right? And this is where judgment comes in, where experience comes in. I mean, there are times when an obstacle comes your way, and it makes sense to figure out a way around it, right? So there is some judgment involved, and sometimes we're going to get it wrong. It's life, right? But we shouldn't see an obstacle and immediately run from it, right? Often the best course is through the difficulty, through the challenge, through the obstacle. And so I just call that mental model, the obstacle is the way. So there you go. That's my thoughts on mental models. I think the real key for you now is figuring out what mental models work the best for you in your career, specific to your field, specific to your life. They may include some that I've talked about. They will undoubtedly include others that I've not talked about. And they may be very specific to you and not generally applicable to other people. That's terrific. But I think if we spend some time thinking about life with mental models in mind, it will help us make better decisions, make faster and more confident decisions, avoid bad decisions, and if nothing else, better understand the world we live in and the people we interact with. So there you go. There's the podcast on mental models. I hope you enjoyed this. As I said, it was a little different than sort of the normal podcast. I'm going to have some more, not on mental models per se, but similar to this here and there over the next couple of months. But join the Facebook group, doorroller.net/Facebook group, and let me know what you think of this. I would love to hear from you. I think the group's up to like 6,200 people, 6,300 people. So it's continuing to grow. Great conversations there. Would love to have you. doorroller.net/Facebook group. Hey, until next time, remember, the best thing money can buy is financial freedom.